If you care about this issue, shout it from the rooftops because it matters. And
We often hear things like religion has caused a lot of wars. And I think the situation is obviously a lot more complex. A lot of times people would use religion as a cover or as a motivating factor for other practical means. Yeah, I mean, you're either stopped at the border, so then you're just in Russia, or you're in Lithuania and you don't get stopped at the border. Well, what would you do?
I don't know. That's why I asked you.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
Shame Russia and Belarus.
Yeah, that was a bit of a meme. Why didn't we think of that before?
It is interesting that even people who supposedly would do a lot of research fall into these sort of traps where they don't actually understand the perspective of the people living there.
Oh yeah, I mean, having a morality is sort of like a weakness.
Yeah, where to begin?
all right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Atheniano Show. Today, I'm joined by the most frequent guests we have, Filip Karaivanov and William Hamilton, for the last physical episode in Edinburgh, or at least for now. Today is going to be another one of these news story episodes. So if you haven't listened to the previous ones, the way it's going to work is we are going to go through a bunch of news stories. I'm going to read some parts of the article, and we're going to talk about it, and then we move on to the next one. The topics we're going to be discussing today are illegal, basically like redwood selling in Mozambique, and how that links to Islamic terrorist attacks. We're going to be talking about Russocentrism in academia. We're going to be talking about weaponization of migrants in Russia and Belarus. We are going to be talking about a Ukrainian new mobilization law. And we're going to be talking about hikimori, which is like a Japanese phenomenon of isolating yourself in your room and doing nothing else for a long period of time. But before we jump into the first story, I just want to say briefly, because I saw this story on the bus here. This is from yesterday. 10 people were killed and 160 others, including children, were abducted during a raid by suspected Boko Haram militants on a remote village in north-central Nigeria on Monday. The attack occurred in the Niger region, which is right next to the Kaduna region, which, if you watched the last video, that is where the kidnappings happened. The kind of the 200 and 200 ones happened a couple months ago. These kidnappings continue to happen. We can speak about them on the podcast. Probably will reach about 200 people, maybe a little more. But if you care about this issue, shout it from the rooftops because it matters. And I know the Israel-Palestine stuff is important, but hopefully you can spare a little bit of time to raise awareness for these kidnappings. So yeah, if you care about it and you want to make it happen, shout it from the rooftops. That being said, let's turn to the first story that we're going to be discussing today. So this is in Mozambique. This is a combination of a bunch of different news stories, but they're all linked. So the first is from News 24. Just says, Islamic State-linked insurgents attacked the town of Macoma in Mozambique's gas-rich Cabo Delgado province, according to people with the knowledge of the matter, in what is their boldest raid in more than 3 years. The violence is the latest string of attacks since December. And then this is from Religion Unplugged. Islamist extremists raging an insurgency in Mozambique have increasingly targeted Christians and church buildings in the first 3 months of the year. As a result, priests and their followers, a total of 100,000 people, have been forced to flee following increased attacks that have left scores of dead and some church buildings destroyed. The renewed attacks are coming at a time when the Mozambique government has been celebrating what it claimed to be a victory over the insurgency that has been raging in the northeastern Cabo Delgado province for the past 7 years. But since the beginning of the year, these terrorists have increased their attacks, making them more frequent and daring. And then in the first 3 weeks of February alone, these terrorists burned a total of 18 churches in 9 villages in the Chirur district. Now, this is from the BBC. The illicit trade with China fueling Mozambique's insurgency. So timber smuggling, estimated to be worth 23 million a year in USD, from Mozambique's ancient forest to China is helping fund a brutal Islamist insurgency as well as a large criminal network in the north of the southern African country. The illicit trade in rosewood I said redwood in the intro, it's rosewood, is linked to the financing of Mozambique's Islamic State-linked militants in the northern province of Cabo Delgado, according to data seen by the BBC from the Environmental Investigation Agency, an NGO that campaigns against alleged environmental crime. Rosewood is a catch-all term for a wide range of tropical hardwoods that are highly prized for luxury furniture in Mozambique. Mozambique's rosewood is protected under an international treaty, meaning only very limited trade that does not threaten the species is allowed. But basically, an undercover investigation by the EIA revealed that because of corruption and illegal logging, trade has gone on consistently, particularly to China. So, as I mentioned earlier, corruption plays a big part in this. Some described it as a symbiotic relationship between Mozambique officials and the governing party. Mozambique has been a beneficiary of Chinese leader Xi Jinping's global infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative, for years, and sources said that the Frelimo party gains legitimacy from attracting both Chinese business and large infrastructure investments and even campaign funds, and therefore is reluctant to criticize or crack down on wide-scale corrupt practices involving these players. So that's pretty much it. I skipped over a lot, but I'll put links to the full articles in the bio. But essentially, we've got Islamic insurgencies attacking Christian people in Mozambique, and because of Chinese rosewood trade, the government is both looking the other way, and this trade is helping fuel the Islamic insurgency's attacks. So, Philip, do you have any additional insight that you want to share with the audience?
Sure. Well, I think the one thing that stood out to me, I guess the first thing we're going to talk about is the religion aspect of this. And what's interesting to me is that we often hear things like religion has caused a lot of wars. And I think the situation is obviously a lot more complex in a lot of these cases, where you would have a practical political concern, which is here you have people who are insurgents who are fighting against the actual governing of the country. But then you also have this layer of religion. And I think a lot of the times it's not obvious which is the real cause. And sometimes, a lot of times people would use religion as a cover or as a motivating factor for other practical means. I think we talked about this in the previous episodes with Nigeria. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the religion doesn't then start to be like a secondary cause. So
yeah, I'd say it like exacerbates it. It never like causes anything at the beginning. It's usually underlying cause, and religion is used as an excuse. But I do think the introduction of religion can sort of make the problem worse and perpetuate.
Exactly. I think like a lot of times it's not a starting cause, but it starts to actually maintain the conflict. And even when the starting cause and the original concerns are met, there's new concerns now which have been used in the escalation of the conflict in the first place.
I mean, what's interesting to me is, so you got China here, right? And we know what China's doing to Muslims in their own country, right? Detainment camps of upwards of 1 million, right? And often in horrible conditions. But here you see them allying with the Islamic insurgents.
Well, so first, the thing I'm not quite clear on in this story is how much is the Chinese government responsible for the rosewood trade as well. So I feel like I understand they're turning like one eye clearly to the trade because beneficial to the richer people in their society. But doesn't directly come from the Chinese government, does it? It's private individuals who are wanting to use for the furniture.
Well, my understanding is that the Chinese government has a pretty large presence in Mozambique. They mentioned what was it, the
Belt and Road Initiative.
Belt and Road Initiative that Mozambique is benefiting from a lot, and they mentioned how the local officials in Mozambique and the government's ruling party wants to continue to have Chinese investment in the country, so they're purposely kind of turning a blind eye to
the redwood trade.
Rosewood. I keep saying redwood, but it's rosewood.
Well, I think there's also another factor, which is that they're maybe not directly, but they're exerting political pressure on the government of Mozambique as well, because it said in the article that they don't want to upset the Chinese government by taking more serious measures to try and stop this, right? So I think there is sort of it's obviously very indirect, and even the actual even in the articles, it doesn't say exactly how they're getting this money. Like, so the insurgents, are they actually using, like, are they cutting down the trees? Are they like involved in this, or are they just allowing people to come in and then they're basically paid for protection of the land? So I think it's a very indirect way of doing it, where it's not obvious to what extent the actual government's involved in putting pressure on Mozambique.
Also, conscious of what I was saying, it is obviously the sort of upper class in China who are benefiting from buying the rosewood illegally. But I don't know if we can make a proper distinction between the government and the upper class in China. Gets quite blurry, in terms of plutocracy and all that. So,
meaning, generally, the upper class in China tend to be buddy with the government.
Pretty much, there's a very strong marriage between corporation and state.
It is interesting too, the little detail that China itself bans rosewood trade, but they're perfectly happy to participate it. Well, to me, what's clear is you're right. Even if it's not the Chinese government that is directly participating in this rosewood trade, to me, I'm probably 95% sure that they're aware of it's happening.
Yeah.
And they're choosing not to do anything about it.
Yeah, I would say probably. I mean, it doesn't seem like they're concerned about it to begin with, and it's probably beneficial for them to have it, right? So I don't think they're in any way. I mean, yeah, you say it's interesting that they proclaim that they're against it as a country, but obviously that's just, speech. It's not really any action that we see here.
I mean, is there any argument we can make here on behalf of Mozambique's government? Because Mozambique is their economy right now is in shambles, right? And they're largely a victim of brutal colonial rule by the Portuguese that has severely impacted, like, again, their economy. Portuguese were just stealing all the resources. And it's a country of, like, don't quote me on this, but I want to say like somewhere between 38 and 70 million people. Like, it's a very large country. And when you're a country that is not on the global, from a strategic perspective, right? When you're a country that you're not on a position to dictate the rules and dictate the way that the international economy is moving, you can make an argument that the strategy is you do have to be willing to play the game a little bit. And if you can get Chinese assistance with your economy by turning a blind eye to an illegal trade, then perhaps they're thinking, okay, well, what's the risk here? We're endangering a species, we're facilitating, or we're not doing anything about a trade toward a severely endangered species, right? They said that the redwood is now the largest, the rosewood, sorry, is the largest illegally traded species in the world by a lot. But and you're potentially helping fund Islamic militants. But at the same time, if you go too hard on China, then you're losing a key economic partner in your development. And so I'm just trying to think, is there any case we can make for the Mozambique government to maybe not do the exact same thing, but to be in a position where they're it's a lose-lose situation, right? Either they take drastic action against the Chinese government and against this trade, and they lose the Chinese investment, or they let it happen and have to deal with the Islamic insurgencies, but at the same time get support from the Chinese for investment.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult situation. I'd say that you can't really like blame them much for needing the Chinese support after, obviously Portuguese colonization they're gonna obviously be a bit wary of the West, and I mean, I doubt the country would be in much better shape if the West were in place of China, to be honest. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, purely practically, if we're looking at like the West is basically talking here about like principles, but it's not really giving any practical solutions to this, whilst China's offering them business. So you can't really say anything against that. I mean, on a international scale, that's more important to a country like that. And it's just well, you said like how many million people live there. It's just hard to keep that many people in control, right, and not have insurgencies. So even if we don't talk about the government being involved in this, there's still the insurgents, right? So yeah, I think I agree. It's just it's a very complicated situation, and you can't really fault any of these practical decisions for the countries.
I mean, so to kind of go to the other side, what are the potential solutions that the West or other major countries could do? Because we've talked about not concerning the rosewood, but we've talked about Islamic insurgencies in various parts of Africa. What are the ways that you think that countries that are quote unquote Christian countries could do to prevent these insurgencies?
I mean, I don't know if they can prevent them because, as I said, I don't think the originating cause is always a religious one. So if we're talking about like practical matters, I also don't think that countries should get overly involved in other countries' business unless we're talking here about just diplomacy and business. So I don't have like a straight answer for what the West should give. But from the articles here that I've read, it doesn't offer anything, right? So that's basically the main thing I'm taking away from this, is that Mozambique doesn't really have much of an option. And we can see that because even the insurgents who are against the government are also working in the trade of rosewood, right? So we see that clearly both sides cannot be that happy because both sides don't have control of the whole country. But they're both willing to go along with this trade because clearly it offers them enough solutions, right, for what they need. So I think you can see the importance of it for them if both sides are willing to go along with it, even though they know that their enemies in this case are also doing it, right? So maybe the West can offer something else that's and some sort of support against the insurgents, right, or something along those lines. But again, I don't know if what can be offered, and I don't know if it should be offered because I don't know that many details on the countries and what's actually going on there. But I think I'm staying consistent here with what I said on the previous one about Nigeria there as well. I thought that Christians should obviously talk more about these issues. They should be aware of these issues, and they should tell their governments about these issues, right, and actually try to bring the religion more into the culture instead of it just being locked away in some church, right?
I mean, there was another article that I didn't share, but it was interesting. It was talking about countries in West Africa and the role that Wagner and other private military companies, um, Russian private military companies, have had in those countries. And I did a paper last semester kind of looking at that. And if you look at most of the surveys within those countries, a lot of those people actually have very positive opinions of those private military companies for the sole reason that they are offering a level of security against um, these insurgents, these terrorist organizations, uh, basically helping halt the violence against the civilians. So, do either of you guys think that something similar to that could be a solution? Maybe not necessarily Russian private military companies, but is there a role for private military companies in general to play in helping halt these insurgencies?
Potentially. I mean, the track record for private military companies and doing stuff isn't great, but I mean, who else are you going to bring in? The UN peacekeepers, you know?
Yeah.
Their track record's even worse.
No, I agree. I mean, it's not ideal, obviously, but if we're talking about some sort of solutions, I think if you want to get involved, I think China and Russia are getting involved in the way that they can, in this sort of helpful way, but also obviously they're setting up their own like spheres of influence where they can actually, you know, dictate certain things in those countries. But it's a pretty clear strategy for a country to do that. It's in its own advantage. It's also to the advantage of the African countries. I mean, it did say here that Mozambique has accepted military aid from South Africa and Rwanda, I think. So there is some of that, but apparently it's not enough. It's not substantial enough to actually keep the northern part of the country.
Well, it seems like you guys want me to move on to the next story. So why don't we do that? Unless, do you have anything else to say about this one?
No.
No?
We're good.
Okay. All right, this is from irregularwarfare.org. People as weapon system. Moscow and Minsk continued attempts to weaponize migration. Weaponized migration, the orchestration or threatened orchestration of sudden influx of refugees by a hostile government to another country for coercive purposes, continues to make appearances as the latest preferred instrument in the modern autocrat's toolkit. Using what was once a favorite strategy of leaders such as Cuba's Fidel Castro, Russia and Belarusian leaders have been accused in recent years of employing this irregular approach as a way to distract Western governments from other malign behavior by instigating political turmoil, forcing spending, and driving the reallocation of military forces to augment border security in Nordic and Eastern European states. And this article says, well, not a new concept. To counter this particularly cool approach, the West must remain both pragmatic and proactive in considering ways to respond to Moscow and Minsk's attempts to weaponize migration. Finland is the only latest country to call out Russia's hidden hand in fomenting migration crises, closing border crossings with Russia for the second time in early December 2023, after more than 200 asylum seekers entered the country from Russia. The Finnish Prime Minister, Petteri Orpo, described the situation as exceptional and accused Russia of trying to undermine Finnish national security with the hybrid operation. Officials in NATO have stated that Russian officials were likely heavily involved in the transport operation that brought migrants from places like Kenya, Syria, and Yemen to the Russo-Finnish border this winter, providing necessary transportation, equipment, and assistance at the border. Specifically, Russia has been accused of paving the way for migrants along its border with Finland by abandoning visa checks in the border zone and providing bicycles, which allow migrants to skirt laws that criminalize approaching Russian border posts on foot. Russia is not the only country weaponizing migrants, as evidenced by the Belarusian president Alexander Lukashenko's behavior since late 2021. By December of that year, at least 8,000 migrants had crossed the Belarusian border into migrant centers in Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania. The pressure exerted by Lukashenko was likely acting in retaliation against EU sanctions because of the treatment of its opponents. Well, morally repugnant, weaponized migration is nevertheless seen as an effective approach by the government to employ it because it necessitates a response from the targeted state. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. It's had severe economic impact. For example, the short-term and near-term financial costs of addressing organized migrant influxes have been significant for the Baltic states. Lithuania alone sought 120 million euros in damages from Belarus in early 2023 to replenish money spent on border infrastructure, including a new barbed wire fence. Further south, the Poland-Belarus border wall reportedly cost Warsaw 353 million euros. Using migrants is thus a low-cost way for national leaders who regard for human life is famously absent to indirectly impose costs on other governments. Okay. That's pretty much it. I can just say this article gives some suggestions on how to combat that. The first is all states impacted by this tactic, from Finland to Poland, should name and shame Russia and Belarus as to discourage this practice from becoming an accepted norm and potentially deter its further use. I don't know how effective naming and shaming.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Please don't do this.
I'm not very convinced by some of these measures here. Again.
And the second is Baltic and Nordic states as well as Poland could also shape mill-to-mill engagements with other unaffected NATO allies to increase multinational training with border guards, potentially sharing best practices regarding border security. At a minimum, NATO should incorporate scenarios similar to those currently experienced by border countries into future war games as a way to feature Russian hybrid operations in more conveniently minded events. All right, so basically, Russia and Belarus are getting migrants to come to their country and then shipping them to other countries as a way of inflicting economic and humanitarian costs on those countries. So, William, I'll start with you. What do you think is the appropriate moral response to this phenomenon? Because there is one solution, which is just like all of the migrants that Russia and Belarus are sending to these countries that are affected by are like, sorry, you can't come in, get the fuck out of here,
Just get
go
completely
back
locked
to your
down.
other countries. Now, in my opinion, that would probably be Russia and Belarus's response if these other countries use the same tactics on them. But supposedly, right, these other countries, like Lithuania, Finland, Poland, care more about human rights than Russia and Belarus, so they're not willing to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean,
if push comes to shove, I feel like they probably would. Whereas now it seems like it's just a slight annoyance. It's not like causing too much trouble. And obviously there's some problems, but I feel like if it was tested eventually, the human rights concerns would probably not be too paramount.
I mean, one question I had is like, it seems like this article is not attributing any agency to both the host countries from which they're coming from, but also the people that are coming, right? Like, what is Russia? One thing that's a little bit unclear to me is what are Russia and Belarus saying to these people that are like causing all of these people in these countries to come to their countries in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I'd never heard of this phenomenon before I read the article, so it did kind of confuse me a little because I'm not sure, what is it. When I first heard it, I thought it was like sort of a gunpoint situation. They just like force people out and say, right, go here. But I imagine it's not what's happening. I don't know, pay them money to leave. I don't know. I'm quite unclear on
No,
that.
but I mean, like, how do they get them to Russia and Belarus in the first place?
Yeah, and that's what I'm thinking. They bribe them and then they tell them to leave. I don't know, come and then leave. It's strange.
Mm. I mean, like, obviously, countries like Yemen, right? Situation is terrible, so the people want to get out. But I don't understand how you end up. You're right. Maybe it's like false promises. Like, if you come here, we'll give you all of this. But presumably, right? These other countries should like catch on and be like, or sorry, not the other countries, but once it happens, people from these countries should be like, all right, I know it's bullshit, you know?
Well, I mean, depending on the country, Yemen, it might even if it's bullshit, it's better than the current predicament. Being shifted around and gone to wherever in order to be used as a tool. Might be okay with that.
Yeah. But also think about it like, all right, let's say you're a migrant and you're in Yemen and your house is being bombed. Bombs are fighting every day in the streets, blah, 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 blah. And then you get this opportunity and Russia's like, oh, come here and you're like, and I'll get shipped to Lithuania, right? And be in the EU. That's not such a bad outcome for them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, you're either stopped at the border, so then you're just in Russia, or you're in Lithuania and you don't get stopped at the border. And they probably know they're probably not going to get stopped at the border to begin with. So, yeah, I mean, it's a clever tactic. I don't have that much to say about it. It seems a bit petty to me, honestly, because it's to do with like countries which are like Finland, for example. I mean, obviously it's because of them becoming a member of NATO, but it just seems kind of a bit petty on Russia's side. I mean, just throwing in some people just to annoy them. I think William was right on that. If it was really like their biggest threat, I think we wouldn't even be discussing moral outcomes. We would be talking about the security of the countries that are involved. I mean, these countries are not like that large countries, like Finland's large, but not in terms of actual
Habitable
places.
areas,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And then Lithuania and Latvia, obviously not. So I think that's something that you guys said. And also, yeah, who are these people? I mean, the article in general, I'm not a fan of because it doesn't answer a lot of these questions. And then we can actually see like the effectiveness of it, because if it was, I mean, even the solutions that are given here, I mean, shame Russia and Belarus,
Yeah, that was a bit of a meme.
and then the NATO countries should share like advice, like notes on the issues. I mean, obviously, I hope they're doing that. I mean, that's like the
Yeah,
least they
why
can
didn't
do.
we think of that before? No?
Yeah, so I don't know. It's happening.
Yeah, but I guess what's interesting for me about it is there is this moral aspect of it. It's like, because you say, again, you said you didn't know this was happening. I think most people don't know this is happening.
Mhm.
And, you get some people that are like, oh, open borders, or you should let refugees in. You should, help people fleeing from countries. And it is like, it does sound kind of like, uh, you know, fake news. A little bit.
a little bit.
A little-
Seriously, some conspiracy.
Like, yeah,
They're
like,
taking people and shunting them into
Yeah, I think also another thing is that when this strategy is being used to actually get something from other countries, sometimes it is used in that way. I think you mentioned like holding a gun to, well, you were talking about the people, but sometimes they do this where like they would pile on a bunch of refugees in a country, and then they would say, if you don't do this, then I'm gonna like let all of them in, right? And you don't have a choice but to accept them because there's too many. You can't control the flow. So I've seen it and I've heard about it being used like that when it's more serious. But again, here it's not used like that. It seems to me like it's just a measure to have some sort of retaliation.
yeah. But it is very interesting the way countries that seem to have no regard. All right, well, this is a tricky subject and it's hard to talk about like in a way that's objective, but if we accept that Russia and Belarus have no regard for human rights and that these other countries do, obviously the binary is not so, but let's just, for sake of argument, let's say it's that. It is kind of strange to me that you can actually weaponize that morality.
Oh yeah, I mean, having a morality is sort of like a weakness at a certain point. So it's like stuff that you can exploit. I think that's like quite clear. If you've got principles, there are stuff that you can exploit.
Mm.
Yeah, I think even people who do talk about a lot of like moral issues in terms of international politics, they, at the end of the day, when you ask them, okay, but what if you're in a dire situation? We're talking about survival here, and even they're like, well, in that case, you don't, you're not as strict on it. So I think people recognize that.
I mean, but this is, I mean, I was just doing some research on the Lithuania election, and this is a big issue for a lot of Lithuanians. I mean, it's a country of 2 million people, right? So if you have if the number, I don't know what the number is, but let's say the number increased to 200,000 in a year. That's a lot of people coming into the country. So I mean, what do you do? How do you, obviously these solutions I think are pretty shit, but I mean, guys, help me. What could be a response besides sending them all back?
Oh, well, you took my one out. Well, no, not sending them
Well,
back.
is that a real? I mean, do you think that's a real response? Sending them all back?
I mean, I don't see why they shouldn't let them in. I mean, maybe there's some sort of, again, I don't know. I mean, this is a poor article. It doesn't give me any information about, again, we don't know who these people are they being forced to be there, where do they come from, and in what condition are they found at the border.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
So
you
if
know,
they
what
are-
happens if they're not let in? It's not really clear. Are they just gonna die?
Exactly. I mean,
We
if
don't
they're
know.
being killed at the border if they don't get in, or if they're being maltreated, obviously then we would have a completely different situation. But if it's just, them being forced in, again, you guys mentioned it before, the alternative case. And in that case, I don't really see a reason that a country should be forced to accept them when it's clearly just a strategy to cause economic problems for that country.
So you just send them back to Russia?
Sure, that's not exactly what I said, but if we want to simplify.
Well, yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's. Let's put it this way. I don't think it's evidently a bad way to deal with this. I don't think it's clearly that's not an option. I think it
With
is
the
an option.
limited information we have, I'd agree with that. Yeah.
Okay.
Hmm.
Well, what would you do?
I don't know. That's why I asked you.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
Well, it seems like you don't want to say denying them in or
well,
sending
I
them
just
back.
feel like you're just gonna get into this we're sending them this direction, and you're sending them this direction, and you're sending them this direction, and you're sending them this direction, and it's just never gonna
Well, no, you just don't let them in to begin with.
So then, so you mean just but Russia's not gonna let them stay.
That's what I said. I don't know what they're gonna do with them, but if Russia is, part of the benefits of this strategy actually is that you're not doing something overtly bad, because what you're doing is just transporting people, right? That's a lot of the reasons why people do this. So I mean, if they want to stay consistent with that, if they just don't, it's just be a failure of an operation, right? They're trying to get them in, they can't get them in. End of story, right? Now, again, we don't know what happens to them, so that's a different question.
Okay, well, let's say hypothetically, for argument's sake, by sending them back, let's say it's 100,000 people from Yemen. And by sending them back, Russia, you know that Russia is going to send them back to Yemen, where they're probably going to either starve to death or die. Then what is the solution? Is it the same?
Depends on the cost of the country. Right? If you can maintain them, then you don't send them back. Or if you can talk with your allies about it, then again, you don't send them back. But if you don't have any other options, then you send them back and you leave it up to Russia.
Same thing?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I think if you wouldn't want to send them back, obviously that's a last resort. But you'd ideally try to spread them out throughout all of Europe, I guess, so they harm as few countries as possible. but it's difficult to have that sort of organization, and most other countries are just going to say no. So,
All right. Let's move to the next one. Philip, I know you're gonna have a lot to say about this.
All right, yeah.
All right. This is Overcoming Russocentrism in Academia by Dimitri Pavatoru in New Eastern Europe. Okay. The full-scale Russia invasion of Ukraine was followed by torrents of discussion and debates and arguments on how, quote-unquote, Russian studies in the West might be reimagined in this new context. In general, pundits agree that more focus is required on the historical context and colonial experiences of the region, as decades of Russocentrism have merely reproduced a plethora of Russian myths and representations about the country's smaller neighbors. These ideas quickly came to be seen as the norm. While these propositions are relevant to more mundane aspects of academic inquiry, which are easy to overlook in day-to-day work, should be given more priority in research in order to retain a minimal level of objectivity. Okay. For decades, Ukraine, together with many Soviet republics, have been overwhelmingly researched from a Russocentric vantage point. Okay, this led to a substantial degree of Western academic and political ignorance concerning Ukraine. Russia's intellectual hegemony over Ukraine in the West was utilized to construct a local hegemonic geographies of Eastern Europe, which in some cases were accepted by a wide group of researchers. According to Professor Taras Kuzio, this hegemony resulted in a palpable crisis in Russian studies whereby the Soviet and the Russian state were analyzed as just an ordinary unit in the international system. Okay. After the breakup of the USSR, Soviet and Russian studies have been redesignated as Slavic or Eastern European studies in many universities across the West. However, this did not lead to a major re-evaluation of curricula or reassessment of the Russian and Soviet imperial past. And then it goes on to discuss realism, which... All right, fuck it, I'll just read this. Among the most prominent advocates of Ukraine's disarmament and neutrality through peace negotiations in line with the Kremlin's demands are the so-called realists. These are academics and commentators who build their arguments, or at least claim to do so, on the basis of Kenneth Walt's groundbreaking theory of neorealism. Enjoying a level of academic hegemony of its own, neorealism portrays IR, international relations, is an eternal fight for survival in conditions of international anarchy. As a result, the state is the basic unit of interactions where the nature of the internal regime does not matter in international interactions. Neorealism attempts to approach knowledge production in the same way as the natural sciences, via observation, evidence collection, and the construction of theories that are then tested to arrive at conclusions deemed to have a universal character. Aimed at elegance and simplicity, the theory, as Waltz himself stated on several occasions, is not a theory of foreign policy. Some of the most prominent neorealist arguments in favor of accommodation concerning Russia's demands in reality abandon the most crucial conventions of this theory. Take John Mearsheimer, for example, whose arguments about Ukraine are posited in an uncompromising axiomatic fashion bordering on dogmatism. In 2014, Mearsheimer famously blamed the West for its liberal delusions in allegedly attempting to draw Ukraine into the EU and NATO. And then he goes on to speak about critical geopolitics, which is supposed to be this new critical way of examining international relations, but he's equally critical of this because he says it's this theoretical approach engages with geopolitical representations, imaginations, and discourses expressed through the media, popular opinion, and academic, and by state leaders. It is then puzzling how Russocentrism, accompanied by uncritical use of Russia-generated discourses, has managed to slip into this academic field. One prominent example can be seen in the contributions by Professor Gerard Toal. His book, his 2017 book on the causes of the wars in Georgia and Ukraine is based on official Russian translations of the Kremlin messages with the aim of investigating Russia's geopolitical culture and the reasons behind its expansionism. Basically, the point is that both of these studies are examining other Eastern European countries, in particular post-Soviet countries, still in from the vantage point of Russia, and then looking at them rather than looking at these countries' autonomy on their own. So that's basically the point of the article, is we need to stop looking at these other countries in academic research and in academic courses through the lens of Russia interacting with these countries and give more autonomy to these specific countries. Which I think is a principle most people can agree with.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, it seems pretty uncontroversial.
But the question is, right, I took a course last semester, Russian foreign policy. And obviously they dealt with Russia's interaction with other Eastern European states in the course. But I think the central point is, right, Russia dominates the politics of that region. So when you're teaching people a course on the region, you kind of have to start with Russia, right? So I don't know if there's any way to deal with, like, would you, in your opinion, and in your opinion, Philip, would you be doing a disservice by saying, okay, we're going to start with like Belarus as a central point and then examine everybody else in the region based on Belarus?
Well, yeah, it wouldn't make much sense with Belarus because, it's if you're going to examine it in terms of
All right,
someone, it's
whatever.
obviously...
Kazakhstan, Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you would... Yeah, I think you can't discuss, like, sort of that region without... It would be sort of like trying to discuss, I don't know, the history of India without talking about, like, British colonial rule, I mean, it's so central to what happened. And, I mean, I guess maybe they want to think about it through the lens of the colonized country instead. But I mean, I think that already happens a decent amount. I don't know exactly how the situation is with the Russia ones, but yeah.
Yeah, where to begin? I guess, yeah, if you're asking about countries in general, they don't really give any specific academic ideas here, so I don't quite know because I haven't studied like Russian studies or Eastern European studies at the university, so I don't know exactly what that experience is like. But yeah, I can agree in a general principle. If you want to study the history of Eastern Europe or you want to understand the self-consciousness of the peoples of Eastern Europe, obviously you cannot just talk about Russia because it's not only the Russian people there, it's not only the Russian nation there. And also the history obviously doesn't involve only Russia. You still have to talk about Russia. Obviously, it's the most successful state in Eastern Europe if we just look at it in terms of power, so, and influence, right? So you have to talk about Russia to begin with. I don't know. I mean, it's in that general sense, I agree with the sentiment of trying to understand it. But again, I agree with William that I don't know if that's being neglected in a sense. I mean, the self-consciousness is definitely neglected, but I don't think we even understand Russian consciousness and how they view themselves as well very well in the West. I mean, so I don't really know how much progress we have there in terms of Russocentrism. I think it's just something that we don't understand of other nations that don't think the same way. So that's one thing. As far as historical things, I think that's an obvious point. So yeah, I don't know. I guess later on it gets to talk about realism and actual academic positions where supposedly there's this Russocentrism. But in terms of the general point that he starts off with, yeah, I think I agree with
that. So is that it?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I would say same. I don't really know much about how the Eastern European study was sort of conducted, you know. it's, as I was saying, it bears a lot of like similarities to the way they talk about decolonizing the curriculum, which has become a bit of a buzzword now. Um, and again, there's some legitimacy to it, but it's definitely just used in, I think, a offhand way, which is just sort of vaguely gesturing at some kind of social reform that isn't very specific, and then you can fill it in with whatever you want.
I wonder if you can make an argument that by continuing to analyze these things in a way that starts with Russia as the focal point, that you're actually continuing to perpetuate Russia as you're actually playing a role in perpetuating Russia as the main actor in that region. Like, because let's just take Eastern Europe, for example, but you can do that with any region. If the main focus of, if most of the courses are based on Russia and Russian history and, you know, Russian language and all of these things, right? Well, then most of the money of the department and most of the resources are going to be going toward learning more about Russia. And I mean, I guess both from a psychological standpoint, but also from a material standpoint, um, you could, I guess, make a case that that's perpetuating Russia's power in the region. And if you wanted to, if the goal was to decrease Russia's power and make it a less significant country, then maybe you should stop paying attention to it in academic studies, and maybe that would help bring about a shift. I don't know how to quantify um, how great that shift would be, but I guess you could make an argument that by shifting the focus away from Russia, and right, you would have no Moscow institutes, you would have no schools, Russian language schools and countries. Um, you maybe do no abroad programs with Russia, and you instead start to have all these programs and all of these things in Ukraine and in Lithuania and in Kazakhstan or whatever, then maybe you start to grow those countries' industries and those economies, and they become more powerful, and de facto that weakens Russia's power. I don't know if that's a real argument you could make.
I mean, I think there's a danger with it though, because I mean, we're talking about academia, so I think the main goal here should be education instead of weakening a certain country's influence. So
Yeah.
I would be worried if my professors are doing what they're doing because they're, they want to weaken the great power of Russia, right? I don't think that's their goal. But if we are talking about education, again, as I said, I agree that we can talk about other countries in the area, especially if we're talking about history, because with history, the landscape changes a lot. So if you begin, in the medieval ages and go from there, or even ancient times, right? I mean, Russia's not the same state. There's other powerful states at that time from other countries. So you get to learn how they were formed and how their interactions with Russia affect them nowadays, because obviously things change in history. But, if we're talking about geopolitics, which I think the article also mentions, I mean, there you kind of have to talk about Russia, right? That's kind of like talking about, I don't know, Asian geopolitics and focusing on Thailand or Vietnam or Nepal or something without talking about India and China, right? Or saying we shouldn't focus on them too much. It's yes, but the situation, the reality just is that their actions affect the world much more at this point in time, right? So if you're talking about geopolitical thinking, I don't think how you can neglect those or not focusing on them as much. I just don't see that as feasible.
Yeah, I guess I think I would say this article would have more legitimacy if it was talking more about um discussions, and if it was more focused on maybe media attention and um the way that stories from other countries are given space in the news, and the things that people are kind of pushed to care about, right? Like you don't ever hear, you would never see a CNN headline about Latvia or about um, Tajikistan, right? Unless Russia invaded one of those countries.
Yeah, I was about to say maybe it's good we don't get headlines for them because, the countries we are talking about right now are maybe not countries that want to be in the newspapers to begin with.
No, but you know what I mean? Like, just if you go on YouTube, right, and you're looking at your feed and you're just like Eastern Europe, right? I mean, even this newspaper, New Eastern Europe, which is supposed to be a, a news organization dedicated to the politics of Eastern Europe. I'd say about 75% of the headlines were about Russia. And even the ones that were about like Georgia and Armenia were just about how those countries are becoming closer to Russia. Um, so I do wonder, I think it is legitimate to make the case that like the internal affairs and the history of other countries are not getting enough attention. Now, I don't know if that's because people don't care about that. Like maybe it's that people don't give a shit about, Ukrainian history or Latvian history or Lithuanian history. They just like they literally give zero shits. And that's why they're not doing it, or it's they don't give any shits because the groundwork from the bottom up hasn't paid any attention to it. So their mindset of thinking about the world and global politics is geared toward, is kind of programmed to wanting to pay attention to the major powers, Russia, China, India, the US, but not these smaller countries.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense. I think the media component is much more relevant and also much more something that you can actually change and talk about without it sounding a little bit silly, like as you were saying with academia. It's like choosing our academia or what we teach in order to influence geopolitics. That's a little
Yeah.
strange.
Well, I think even with the Ukraine war, I mean, we saw that people didn't know anything about Ukraine before the Ukraine war. I mean, a lot of people didn't even know where it's on the map. Now people know cities, right? They know some history. So
They didn't know it was a separate language.
right, exactly. So you see these sorts of things, but again, it's this thing where how much is it a problem? I mean, obviously, we would like everybody to know more about the world in general, but it's just the way we're structured, right? We have a limited set of things that we can know. And I mean, again, like we're talking about Eastern Europe here. I mean, because it's close to us, right? So in terms of like politics, maybe you should know something about it. But for example, if we say, what do you know about, Nepal or something, right? Or Bhutan, like people are like, what? Right? So it's again, you could make the same argument there about, well, it's just India and China. Like, why are we not talking about these smaller nations? And I think you're actually doing a lot to counter this because of those videos that you have about the elections, right? I thought those were quite interesting because it was like, oh, there's actual like political movements and ideas growing in other countries that I didn't, I'm not keeping track of, obviously.
Yeah, you're doing your part. Well done.
But you made an interesting remark about like there's no ethical harm we're doing by not talking about these countries.
Yeah, I don't think there's like a
Do
direct
you agree
ethical.
with that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's any ethical harm being done.
I mean, like, all right, let's take Bulgaria. I'm not gonna say anything about the politics of Bulgaria. I'm just
Well, I was about to say maybe you want to use a different example if you want me to be objective about what I say.
Well, that's the point. I don't want you to be objective about it.
Okay.
Like, would you feel better if more outlets in Western Europe and were talking about the situation in Bulgaria and were raising awareness to things that were happening in Bulgarian in like life, culture, if more people were knowledgeable about Bulgarian history, literature, etc.?
I mean, again, I don't think I understand why they're not, Right. So that's kind of the thing. Obviously, would I like it? Sure. I mean, what kind of person wouldn't like people knowing more about their culture? Right? I don't know if anybody who's like against that idea, but it's just not. I understand why it's not prevalent. I mean, even with people who do articles on Bulgaria, or I would assume this goes for other countries as well. Um, it is interesting that even people who supposedly would do a lot of research fall into these sort of traps where they don't actually understand the perspective of the people living there. So even if people like that, have this, what was it called in the article, like Orientalism, right? This perspective, Western perspective, and there's journalists whose job it is to actually go there and research it. I mean, how much are we going to expect of ordinary people, right? Again, this was about academia to begin with, but it's kind of the same.
Yeah. Well, and I think you raise an interesting observation when you're talking about, okay, but how much people actually know about like Russian people, right? Like these countries, China, Russia, are huge, and the viewpoints differ a lot, and there's a lot of different parts of Russia, right? Like,
And we're not exactly friendly with them in terms of like, I know people who were interested and had gone there and actually researched it, but I mean, even with countries who are closer to the West in terms of like, I don't know, Hungary or something, people just don't know much about them, even though you can easily go there and, start to actually learn something about the culture. But even then, it's like people don't understand the actual like perception that those countries have of the world and of themselves. And I think it's understandable why. I mean, it's quite difficult to get a different perspective from your own.
well, like, so the point I'm trying to get at is, like, what are we actually studying or learning about when we are studying these things? Like, it seems like we're not actually, particularly when we're focused on geopolitics, we're not actually learning about these countries. Like, it's not like when you take a class on Russian politics, you're not like actually doing a deep dive into the Russia psyche and all of these things in Russian history and all of these different authors and all of these different things. What you're really doing is you're getting a perspective on how Russia has influenced the world around you, right? And the major events that have kind of shaped the world. The Russian government and political movements in Russia that have shaped the world around it, right? So it seems like what this article is advocating for, this deeper knowledge of other Eastern European countries. Um, you can make the same argument for Russia and China because the energy is not necessarily going into understanding everything about these countries. It's just about how do these countries affect the world.
In other words, how do they affect us?
How do they affect us? Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like our friend Anshin, as evidenced by the last podcast, right? We have no idea, what ordinary Chinese people actually are thinking, right? And news outlets and stories that we get in the West about China, and we think we know stuff about China because of that, could be interpreted or could be viewed in an entirely different way through ordinary people in China, right? And they could have an entirely different perspective. So we may think we're knowing something about this country, but we don't actually know, we don't actually understand it from, we're not actually taking steps to look at it from their lens.
Yeah, within their perspective. Yeah, exactly. And I think basically the article touches on a much more major issue that it doesn't like ever explore, right? I mean, I think it starts off that way, but then it goes into another area which we'll discuss probably soon. But this idea that you're talking about and that I think we're all talking about, like understanding actually the self-consciousness and the understanding that the people in those countries have. I just don't think I don't even know if we strive to do that, right? Especially if we're talking about just political courses. I mean, I think they're just, as you said, they're about how those countries act on the political stage, right? It's not about how they perceive the world, or any like deeper motivations about why they do that. Maybe history courses are closer to that.
Maybe, and you know, there are people who like specialize in certain countries, and those people are going into the country doing ethnographic, sociological studies of those countries, right? And it's not just Russia, right? You have professors who specialize in Baltic, you know, politics, specialize in Balkan politics. Um, it's just when you're teaching a wide course on politics and you're covering Eastern Europe, and most of the time, right, you don't have 2 years to just, you know, everybody goes to all the countries in Eastern Europe. You probably have in these courses like a week max to cover it, right? And so there's only so much you can do in those courses, right?
Yeah, from what I've seen, if we're talking about like the Balkans, for example, the people who have the best understanding are people who just live there.
Live there.
I mean, like I'm talking about like Western journalists, for example. Like they would actually go there. They travel around the countries. They normally like stay in some, Belgrade or Sofia or whatever, and they actually listen to the news there, and they see what the people talk about on the street. And they're the closest I've seen to actually capturing it. But a lot of the times I would read the articles which just seem completely outlandish, right? It's clear that you're taking one perspective and then you're like imposing it on a different situation, and that's easier to do where you're just taking your own perspective and you're seeing, okay, how does this situation, how can I categorize it in my perspective? And the opposite of that would be to learn a completely different perspective and see how things categorize when you look at it from that point of view.
Yeah.
But that's completely that's very difficult to do because you actually have to understand why they're viewing it that way and construct it in your mind, and that's more difficult to do than just figuring out, oh, okay, so I have like, I have a category for bad things and I have a category for good things. I'm obviously oversimplifying. And then you just go into a new area and you're like, okay, in this country, who are the bad ones, who are the good ones, according to my preconceived notions of those categories.
Yeah. But by the way, what you're just talking about, right? I think kind of the point of realism is like it's not supposed to be this super detailed description of everything that's happening and all the minute details. The point is that it is a simplification and it is an abstraction, but that's part of the benefit of it. Is it takes a really, really complex situation and all of these finite details and all of these things, and it gives a very simple picture of them that is generally right in most cases.
Yeah, so I would say the only thing I agree with this article about in terms of the realism issue is that it characterizes it as a type of natural science where the idea is that you're analyzing human nature.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you wanna?
It's a bit confusing sometimes because it's supposed to be a descriptive theory of like how states actually act, and then it mentioned it's on a foreign policy. To go from the sort of descriptive to the normative, you need like a bit more of a push, and I feel like
Mearsheimer takes it to a normative.
Yeah.
So I would say that, I mean, if I had to describe myself in a way, I'll probably say I'm a realist in terms of the like actual international politics side of it.
We have to say though that there's multiple types of realism.
Exactly. So that I was about to say, like, when I say really, I've got my own, just the way I view things, and then I'm just calling that realist because it seems to match a lot of this stuff. And in terms of like what you mentioned about normativity, that is an interesting thing because I think there is obviously a normative component to realism, which is, I mean, at base, it's the survival of the state matters the most. I mean, I think that's a normative component of realism. I don't see how you can say it's just descriptive, because unless again, you can always try to characterize it that way, but I think in the end it is normative. So I agree with that. It's not a completely descriptive theory. But I think the criticisms here, I mean, how many were there? There was like a couple of criticisms to do with, the black box idea. Like for example, like countries being a black box where you're not supposed to talk about their internal affairs. I mean, the way I view it is that the internal affairs do matter in terms of external affairs. I don't think the opposite conclusion would be very reasonable. I mean, that would be equivalent to saying what happened inside of Germany when it became Nazi Germany, right, is irrelevant to the international policies of Germany after, or like that led to the Second World War, right? I mean, I think nobody says that. I think the idea of the black box and what it's trying to do is to say that whatever ideology you have, whatever perspective that I was just talking about, the perspective that you have on the world that's founded by your culture and it's contained in your country, when you're talking about international politics, that becomes a black box because that's just that country's ideology, right? It no longer plays when you're talking about the bigger game of all the countries together. So, for example, Hitler could have constructed his own, and he did, his own idea of who's, the highest power, who has the most authority, who should, he even had like a theory of race, right? Everybody knows this. But all of that, in the end of the day, is self-contained in whatever he has control over, which is Germany. And that's obviously why he wanted to control everything else. So that's, once you go into the international level, Germany is just like any other country, right? It doesn't matter what he thinks about it. That's not reality. That's until he controls everything, right? That wouldn't be reality. So that, I think that's the idea of the black box, is that your ideology, your culture, all of that is just irrelevant when we're talking about the actual like international
Scale.
policies, because now we're saying, okay, sure, Russia thinks that, Germany thinks that Russia has, communism, or Britain has its own ideas, but it's like, but they all have the same resources, and in terms of like war, and they all have the same ways of exercising their power, and that's the competition that's happening on an international scale. So the ideology actually only applies internally. I think that's the idea of the black box, not that the internal doesn't affect the external at all, because obviously it does.
Right. There's a difference between understanding why a certain country has the foreign policy it does, and then studying how that country's foreign policy interacts and plays a role in the international order.
Exactly.
Right? And neorealism does not, realism actually kind of posits a theory about why a country has the foreign policy that it does. But neorealism is more focused on how does the foreign policy that that country has affect the international order, but not necessarily how do the internal and minute details of that country shape that country's foreign policy.
Right.
And, so I mean, I think a lot of people miss this when they talk about critiques of realism. It's not meant to be this holistic perspective of everything about a certain country. It's just supposed to give an overview of how that country's foreign policy plays a role with other countries' foreign policies in the international arena.
Yeah, and I think that's why, there was this quote that the article, because it's saying that John Mearsheimer is wrong about a lot of stuff, and then it quotes him saying that we should understand how Russia thinks, and then that's supposed to be like a bad thing in terms of like, it's one of the bad quotes that it says. But his whole idea was that, as far as I understand it, when I heard him actually like talk about this in a lecture, was that you should understand how they think, because the idea is that you have the black boxes that are in the world, and then each one has its own ideology, and obviously that ideology also affects how they think about the outside world and what their relations are with the outside world. So when you're trying to be diplomatic with another nation, your priority shouldn't be to take your own ideology, which is self-contained, right? It doesn't apply on the world scale. It's just in your country, and then you're trying to take that and then apply it to the other country that you're trying to be diplomatic with. It doesn't work that way, right? You need to understand how they view the situation, because that's how you predict what they're going to do once you do something else, right? So obviously, if you can do this interpersonally as well. Obviously, if you want to know what a person's going to do, you're not going to think, what would I do with all of my beliefs? You're going to try and people do say you should do that, but that's because we can't get into other people's heads, right? With countries, it's different, because we can know what they think if you just try to understand them, which is what we were talking about in terms of self-consciousness before.
Right. Yeah, that's a good link back.
William, do you have any further comments before we move on to the next?
No, I don't think so. I think
Okay.
Filip had a lot to say on this. It's going quite.
It was good commentary, though.
Yeah, definitely.
I enjoyed it. Okay.